Karoline Leavitt looked straight into the camera and called Africa a zoo. But it was the quiet, measured response from Ibrahim Traoré that flipped the entire conversation on its head. The moment didn't last more than 5 seconds. But in today's world, 5 seconds is all it takes to throw a grenade into global discourse. It happened on a Thursday evening during a panel on international development, broadcast live from a studio in Scottsdale, Arizona. Karoline Leavitt, a rising voice in conservative political circles, sat on a panel with 3 others, an economist, a retired ambassador, and a young African scholar named Nuru Kambu. The discussion had been tense but civil, until Leavitt leaned forward, her voice sharp, her tone impatient. "I mean, let's be honest," she said, brushing back her hair. "We keep sending billions of dollars in aid to countries that can't even organize a functioning road system. Some of these places operate like a zoo. There's no structure, no leadership, just chaos." The silence was immediate. You could hear Nuru suck in a breath. The host's eyes darted off camera. The retired ambassador frowned but didn't speak. And for half a second, it seemed like Leavitt herself didn't quite realize what she had said. But then the camera cut to Nuru. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I was born in Ouagadougou," he said. "The hospital I was born in was funded and built by Burkina workers, not aid. The school I went to had 1 broken fan and 10 broken windows, but the kids inside? Smarter than most of the Ivy League grads I've met here. So if we're calling that a zoo, I'd say it's one hell of a well-run one." That's when the internet exploded. Within an hour, the clip was on YouTube, then Instagram, then TikTok. The hashtag #AfricaIsAZoo trended in under 2 hours. But it wasn't just the outrage that gave it legs. It was the pause. That moment of silence after Leavitt's comment. Viewers couldn't look away. It felt raw, too real to be scripted. Social media did what it does best. Screenshots, reaction videos, duets. Within the next 6 hours, nearly every African news outlet had picked up the story. Young influencers in Accra and Dakar were posting their reactions, some emotional, some furious, some just heartbroken. By midnight, professors from Howard and UCLA were unpacking the implications live on Instagram. CNN ran a quick segment. Fox News stayed quiet. And Karoline Leavitt, she wasn't on social media, not that night. Her team posted a vague message about spirited discussion and freedom of speech. But the damage was already deep and getting deeper. Meanwhile, the original clip gained over 10 million views by sunrise. In Johannesburg, a woman named Info started a thread. "My uncle died trying to get medicine during apartheid. He wasn't an animal in a zoo, he was a man, and now I'm here raising his grandson, and we both work in solar energy. Don't talk about us like that." In Baltimore, a teenager named Jerome posted a TikTok reaction with tears in his eyes. "My dad's from Burkina Faso. He always told me never to let anyone call you lesser. Now I know why." The story was no longer just about a bad comment. It was about dignity, the kind that doesn't make headlines until someone tries to strip it away. And it wasn't just the usual voices weighing in. Several African presidents, ministers, and ambassadors reposted the clip. Some attached statements, most didn't. The image spoke for itself. But while the fire raged online, one man stayed quiet, and it was the silence everyone noticed. President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso hadn't said a word, not a tweet, not a press release, not even a facial expression caught by paparazzi, just silence. People began to wonder, would he respond? Was he hurt? Was he furious? Or was he simply planning something? But whatever he was doing behind the scenes, people were already bracing for impact. By sunrise in Washington, D.C., the storm had reached full tilt. Major news outlets scrambled to include the clip in their morning coverage. Some tried to downplay it, calling it just another internet fire. Others recognized it for what it was, a raw nerve hit on live television, and the shockwaves weren't slowing down. MSNBC brought on a panel of foreign policy analysts. CNN opened their broadcast with a side-by-side shot of Leavitt's comment and a wide aerial view of Ouagadougou, buzzing with life, construction, and commerce. The contrast was striking. Meanwhile, TikTok was relentless. A South African content creator posted a stitched video showing side-by-side images. Karoline Leavitt talking, and Burkinabe children in school uniforms solving advanced algebra on a blackboard. Zoo, the caption read, or future doctors? Young people across the continent, Lagos, Nairobi, Accra, Kinshasa, started posting duets. Some danced, some raged, some told personal stories. A 22-year-old Kenyan coder shared footage of the app she was building to connect rural farmers to city vendors, with one sharp sentence at the end. If this is a zoo, what does that make your tech bros? But it wasn't just Africa responding. In Sacramento, a group of African-American high schoolers organized a walkout. Their signs weren't polite. One said simply, "We know what you meant." In Detroit, a community radio show invited Burkinabe American parents to speak about what it felt like to hear their homeland described with a slur wrapped in condescension. Still, there were defenders. Conservative commentator Lee Varnes tweeted, "Leavitt was making a larger point about corruption and mismanagement. Stop pretending every comment is a hate crime." Others followed, retweeting the original clip with captions like, "She's just telling the truth," or "Finally someone said it." But even among her usual supporters, something felt different this time. The tone was defensive, nervous, because they knew, and Karoline Leavitt probably knew it too, the conversation had already moved past the political lanes they were comfortable in. This wasn't just about foreign aid or policy. It was about how people see each other. Who gets to define developed? Who decides what counts as progress? Meanwhile, inside African embassies in Washington and across Europe, phones were ringing nonstop. Press inquiries, requests for interviews, public statements. The demand for a comment from President Traoré grew by the hour. In Ouagadougou, things remained strangely calm. The local press covered the scandal with restraint. National TV stations replayed the debate, followed by local voices urging people not to react emotionally, but to watch what would come next. You could feel a country waiting, not for vengeance, but for something more deliberate. By mid-afternoon, a quiet but symbolic moment happened on Twitter. The official account for Burkina Faso's Ministry of Education posted a photo. It showed 5 young women, engineering students, standing in front of a newly constructed water purification system. No caption, just the flag in the corner and the project name, "Built by Us." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Meanwhile, in Washington, Leavitt's team canceled her scheduled appearance on a popular evening show. They didn't say why, but a staffer anonymously told a reporter, "She's being told to wait this out." That same night, African diaspora communities across the U.S. began hosting online spaces, Zoom meetings, Twitter spaces, Instagram lives, where people vented, shared, and processed. One room had over 4,000 attendees, including doctors, musicians, professors, and high schoolers. Everyone had something to say, but one theme echoed again and again. This isn't new. This is just public now. The impact wasn't only emotional, it was financial. A handful of companies sponsoring Leavitt's media platform began pulling back. A luxury skincare brand posted that statements made by associated partners do not reflect our values, and quietly ended their campaign deal. Others were watching closely, waiting to see if this would blow over or blow bigger. And through it all, the name Ibrahim Traoré kept trending, but he remained silent. That silence didn't come across as weak. It felt like the calm before something measured. People speculated online. Would he give a speech, hold a press conference, launch a social campaign? Some hoped for a fiery takedown. Others wanted dignity. Everyone just wanted something. By now, the original clip had reached over 30 million views. Commentary was popping up in Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Arabic. The message had become universal. This wasn't just about one insult. This was about a larger wound, one that people were tired of covering up. But while Leavitt's camp tried to contain the damage, the real story was brewing somewhere quieter, far from press rooms and hashtags. In a modest government building tucked between two mango groves on the edge of Ouagadougou, a long wooden table sat empty. No cameras, no advisors, no political fanfare, just silence. For 2 full days, President Ibrahim Traoré said absolutely nothing. No press release, no press conference, no tweet. He went about his schedule without changing a single item. He met with education officials. He reviewed construction permits for a rural health center in Fadangurma. He signed off on local grain distribution policies. Cameras followed him as usual, but none were allowed to ask questions. And still, the world waited. That silence didn't feel like retreat. It felt like restraint, intentional, grounded, almost surgical. While American networks speculated endlessly, asking if Traoré would retaliate, demand apologies, or issue sanctions, he simply worked. In a digital age ruled by hot takes and instant reactions, his silence began to feel louder than Leavitt's comment. Even his political opponents, both within Burkina Faso and in the region, admitted as much. A well-known critic from Côte d'Ivoire tweeted, "Say what you want about Traoré, but this silence is not cowardice. It's timing, and it's genius." Inside the presidential office, his advisors urged him to respond. Some wanted fire, others suggested a formal address to the United Nations. But Traoré had something else in mind. He called for a meeting with a group of young civil engineers, not ministers, not diplomats, engineers. 22 students arrived at the presidential compound the next day. They were nervous. Some wore their Sunday best. Others came in worn sneakers and t-shirts from a local tech conference. Traoré greeted them himself. He asked one question: "What are you building?" One young woman named Aissata explained how her team was designing solar-powered filtration systems for villages near the Ghana border. Another, named Bukari, was working on an affordable concrete mix to rebuild roads that had been damaged by seasonal floods. A third had a blueprint for a mobile app to connect rural farmers with city markets. Traoré listened. He didn't take notes. He didn't interrupt. He just listened. Then he said, "In a few days, I want to show the world who you are. Not with press, not with politics, just with truth." He had a cameraman follow them, not for a documentary, but for a moment. One small, quiet window into the real life behind the headlines. Meanwhile, in the U.S., the media was growing impatient. Several outlets tried to reach Traoré's team for interviews. Some sent reporters to Burkina Faso. Most were turned away politely, but firmly. A journalist from Kansas City managed to speak with a local teacher named Mamadou outside a library in Bobo Dioulasso. When asked how he felt about Leavitt's comments, Mamadou smiled and shook his head. "She doesn't know us," he said. "That's not her fault. But now she will." At that same moment, back in Washington, Leavitt's team was starting to feel the strain. Her sponsors had paused all engagements. 3 of her appearances were canceled. Her inbox was flooded, not just with hate, but with difficult questions. Internally, her staff was divided. Some believed she should double down and frame herself as a victim of woke outrage. Others thought she needed to issue an apology immediately and get ahead of Traoré's eventual response. But every attempt they made to steer the narrative failed, because the truth was, they didn't know what he was going to do. And worse, they didn't know when. The silence began to eat at them. Pundits speculated that Traoré had missed his moment, that if he waited too long, the world would move on. But deep down, people were still watching. There's something different about a man who doesn't need to shout. It wasn't just silence anymore. It was suspense. Social media reflected it. Memes of a clock ticking with Traoré's face surfaced. African creators joked about the calm before the calm. A popular comedian in Senegal did a skit pretending to be a U.S. media exec. "Please, Mr. President, say something before we start looking even worse." And then, late on a Sunday afternoon, The Burkina Faso presidency quietly posted a 27-second teaser. No music, no voiceover, just video. The opening shot showed a young girl, maybe 11 years old, walking down a dirt path with a lunchbox and a science textbook under her arm. She turned to smile at the camera. The post was captioned with 5 words: "He will speak very soon." But no one was ready for how he'd do it. Monday morning arrived like any other in Ouagadougou. The sun hung low, golden and already warm. Birds called from tall neem trees, motorcycles hummed past intersections, and shopkeepers arranged their stands. No one knew exactly when the video would drop, only that it was coming. Then, without warning, it appeared. No countdown, no press alert, just a quiet upload to the official presidency account, a 4-minute, 12-second video titled, "To Those Who Still See Us as Animals." The thumbnail showed President Ibrahim Traoré standing under a faded red awning in front of a modest-looking building. No flags, no podium. People clicked. The first shot opened inside a hospital hallway. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above polished tiles. It wasn't pristine, but it was clean, functional. Nurses walked past with trays of medicine. A child giggled from a nearby room. A janitor swept with steady rhythm. Then the camera cut to Traoré. He stood alone in the middle of the hallway. No security, no entourage, just him. "I've been silent for 3 days," he began, his French lightly accented, but the English subtitles clear and simple. "Not because I didn't hear what was said, but because when someone calls your home a zoo, shouting back only gives them the reaction they're hoping for." He turned slightly, motioning down the corridor. This is the pediatric wing of a hospital built entirely by Burkina architects, engineers, and workers. Some of them are in their 20s. We didn't need loans. We didn't need foreign consultants. We needed belief. The camera followed him as he walked slowly past open rooms. In one, a mother spoon-fed rice porridge to her toddler. In another, 2 nurses laughed quietly over paperwork. None of them posed. None even seemed to notice they were being filmed. Traoré stopped at a window. You see no marble, no luxury chairs. But inside these walls, people are healing. Every day, without headlines, without pity. He paused. And yet someone still looks at us and sees animals in a cage. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look angry, but his words struck like thunder. "Burkina Faso is not perfect," he continued. "We have problems, like every nation. But we are not chaos. We are not creatures. We are builders." The next shot showed a young boy in a hospital bed drawing on a piece of cardboard. The camera zoomed in slowly. It was a sketch of a house with solar panels on the roof and a garden out front. Traoré's voice returned. "You ask why we don't have skyscrapers. We ask why you think they're the only thing worth measuring." Then he delivered the line that would echo across the globe. "We may not have skyscrapers, but we are building something far stronger. Our future." The screen faded to black. No logo, no anthem, just silence. And then, the world lost its breath. Within minutes, the video was reposted by major outlets across Africa. Influencers translated it into Swahili, Arabic, Portuguese, and even Mandarin. Hashtags like #OurFuture and #NotAZoo flooded timelines. It was raw, it was real, and it was everything people didn't expect from a head of state. Traoré didn't attack, he didn't shame, he didn't ask for sympathy, he simply told the truth and showed it without filters. On TikTok, a Ghanaian nurse stitched the video, tears in her eyes. He spoke for all of us. On Twitter, a Black British writer said, "This is how you answer ignorance, not with rage, with reality." In Paris, a well-known actor reposted the video with the caption, "No more excuses, no more pretending we don't know what we look like when we speak this way." Back in the U.S., Karoline Leavitt's camp went silent. Reporters reached out for comment. No reply. A few pundits tried to spin the video, calling it manipulative or overly emotional. But the response drowned them out. And for once, it wasn't just activists or scholars speaking. Ordinary people, the ones who rarely say anything online, started sharing it. A grandmother in El Paso, a taxi driver in Philadelphia, a high school teacher in Boise. Something in Traoré's tone had cut through all the noise and found a place that politics rarely touches: the gut. Even those unfamiliar with Burkina Faso felt it, because it wasn't just about one country anymore. It was about respect, about who's allowed to be proud, about who gets to narrate their own existence. But as the video soared across continents, new conversations began behind the scenes, and not everyone was calm about it. The day after the hospital video aired, everything shifted. It wasn't just trending anymore. It had graduated into something bigger, more personal. You didn't need to know anything about politics or foreign aid to feel it. People connected to it on a different level. They weren't just watching a response. They were watching dignity hold its ground without raising a fist. Within 24 hours, Traoré's video was subtitled in over 20 languages, not by the government, but by volunteers. Activists in Morocco, teachers in Sweden, college students in Brazil, they all pitched in. Some even dubbed it over in their native tongues so their grandparents could understand. News anchors around the world replayed that one line like a chorus. "We may not have skyscrapers, but we are building something far stronger, our future." And for a while, it didn't feel like a political moment. It felt like something more intimate, like someone finally said out loud what so many people had been trying to explain their whole lives. And now, finally, it had a shape. In Johannesburg, a mural of Traoré went up overnight on the side of a brick wall, his face with the words, "Respect is not charity," stenciled beneath it. In Rio de Janeiro, a street artist posted a video painting the same quote in Portuguese near a school playground. But the impact wasn't only visual, it was deeply emotional. In Tucson, Arizona, a 34-year-old teacher named Myra, who taught world history at a public middle school, played the video in her classroom. The students were quiet afterward, not because they were bored, but because they were thinking. One boy, born to Ghanaian immigrants, raised his hand and said, "I wish people talked about us like that more." That hit her hard. Meanwhile, major media outlets who had initially stayed on the fence started to shift. The New York Times ran a front-page editorial titled, "The Sound of Respect." The BBC aired a segment on the hospital featured in the video, highlighting how it had been designed by a 26-year-old woman named Katie, who used to draw floor plans in chalk on her childhood bedroom wall. Celebrities reposted the video, but for once it didn't feel performative. Idris Elba, Lupita Nyong'o, and even Leonardo DiCaprio shared it, each one letting Traoré's voice speak for itself, no flashy captions or hashtags. Even in unexpected places, the conversation had changed. At a diner in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a middle-aged couple sat watching the video on a waitress's phone. The husband, who had served in the Peace Corps decades ago, murmured, "They didn't show us this side back then." It was happening everywhere. People started asking deeper questions, ones that weren't about Karoline Leavitt anymore. Questions like, why do we equate skyscrapers with success? Why do we assume we know what's best for places we've never been? Why is poverty always shown but not resilience? Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, life went on. Kids walked to school, vendors sold fruit under the sun, and President Traoré went right back to work, refusing any interviews or international requests. His team issued one short message: "We said what we needed to say." Back in Washington, Leavitt's PR team scrambled. They knew they'd underestimated him. They had expected a harsh clapback, something they could spin as emotional or overly sensitive. Instead, they got a masterclass in poise, and the world noticed. At her next scheduled appearance, Leavitt canceled last minute, citing health concerns. But inside her media circle, people weren't convinced that she was ill. They suspected something else: panic. Her public image had taken a real hit, not just among political opponents, but among moderates who had once given her the benefit of the doubt. The narrative had slipped completely out of her hands, and for many people, something had snapped. This wasn't just a story about one ignorant remark anymore. It was about something deeper, long overdue. A reckoning not just with the way Africa is talked about, but with the language used to measure value. A quiet movement had started. Parents were asking schools to add modern African development to their history curriculums. Bookstores began restocking African authors. Podcasts popped up overnight, analyzing the hospital video in detail. No loud protests, no boycotts, just perspective and pride. But far from the cameras and commentaries, behind closed doors in the U.S., the tension was rising, and decisions were being made that would shape what happened next. Inside a nondescript office building in Arlington, Virginia, the mood was thick. Karoline Leavitt's crisis team, assembled quickly and expensively, was seated around a long glass table. Half of them had laptops open. The other half were on their phones, scrolling through mentions, monitoring media pickup, and calculating how badly the situation had spiraled. One advisor, a former campaign handler named Rick Hanley, stared at the wall-mounted screen replaying Traoré's hospital video for the 5th time that morning. "This wasn't supposed to go global," he muttered. Karoline sat across the room, silent. She looked tired, not from the internet backlash, she had weathered those before, but from the fact that this time she'd hit something deeper, something she didn't quite understand. "Damage control window is closing," said one media strategist. "And honestly, the longer we wait, the worse it gets." Another younger aide added, "He didn't even insult you. That's what makes it dangerous. He came across calm, human. We can't spin it." Karoline finally spoke. "What if we go hard on the point I was trying to make? Government mismanagement, corruption, foreign aid abuse." Hanley cut her off. "Oh, no one's listening to that anymore. That line's done. You said zoo, Karoline. That word's not going away." She stared down at her phone. On Instagram, someone had tagged her in a video. 2 young girls in Burkina Faso watching Traoré's speech and clapping when he finished. One of them had a homemade sign that read, "Not animals, not beggars, builders." The comments underneath were brutal but honest, and that honesty stung more than the anger. Elsewhere in Washington, lobbyists were holding their own meetings, quiet, urgent ones. Some had ties to West African development projects and now feared this scandal might disrupt business. They didn't want to publicly condemn Leavitt, but they couldn't afford to be associated with the fallout either. A senior official from USAID sat in a briefing room that afternoon, reviewing ongoing partnerships in West Africa. Someone asked if funding allocations would be affected by the backlash. He sighed and said, "We'll need to reassure our partners we're not on the same page as whatever that was." Behind the scenes, media figures who once supported Leavitt began to distance themselves. A well-known radio host quietly removed her past interview from his podcast library. A conservative think tank postponed a panel where she was slated to speak. No one wanted to say it outright, but they were all waiting for her to apologize, not because they thought she was sorry, but because the silence was costing them. Meanwhile, Traoré's video was still spreading. A major university in Canada played it during a panel on ethical leadership. A senator in New Jersey referenced it in a speech about rethinking foreign aid. Even the Vatican's official news arm shared it with the headline, "The Grace of a Measured Response." And still, Leavitt said nothing. Because behind that silence wasn't confidence. It was fear. Fear of saying the wrong thing again. Fear of looking weak. Fear of losing everything she had built on being bold and unapologetic. Her team debated every option. A formal apology written by a lawyer? Too cold. A tearful interview? Too forced. A visit to Burkina Faso? Too risky. It could backfire. Eventually, someone suggested silence was the best option. Let it fade. People move on. But not everyone agreed. "Not this time," Hanley said. "This isn't just politics anymore. This is personal. People saw something in that man they haven't seen in years. Restraint with strength. It's rare. That's why they listened. He paused, then added, "If you don't respond, you're not just losing the argument. You're losing the story." That night, Karoline sat alone in her apartment, staring at her laptop. The hospital video was playing again, this time with a new overlay someone had added, a mosaic of African students, builders, and artists behind Traoré's voice. She closed the laptop slowly. For the first time since the scandal broke, she looked unsure. And for a woman whose brand was built on certainty, that feeling didn't sit right. But while she hesitated, others were already rewriting the conversation, and they weren't waiting for her permission. In the days that followed, something quiet but powerful began to grow. The spotlight shifted, not away from the controversy, but deeper into it. Away from Karoline Leavitt's slip of the tongue and into the stories of the people she had unknowingly spoken about. And what surfaced wasn't fury, it was pride. Networks that rarely covered African development suddenly had no choice but to lean in, not because of pressure, but because the audience was now paying attention. In Minneapolis, a local channel aired a segment on a group of Burkina immigrants who had built a cooperative farming project in the suburbs. No loans, no handouts, just sweat, patience, and belief. One of the men, Adama, wore a shirt that said, "Builder, not a burden." His interview was calm and direct. "We didn't come here to ask for anything," he said. "We came to grow something new." His voice, soft but firm, traveled far beyond the local station. Clips of the interview made it onto national outlets, and within a few hours, the clip was trending. A high school teacher in Albuquerque printed the quote and pinned it on her classroom wall. Meanwhile, a popular YouTuber based in Nairobi posted a short documentary about her grandfather, a retired builder who helped construct over a dozen rural schools after Burkina Faso's independence. "He never had electricity in his own home," she said, holding back tears. "But he made sure hundreds of children studied under real roofs." Her video racked up over 2 million views in 2 days. People wanted these stories now, because for so long they had only been shown one side: poverty, conflict, aid dependency. But now, there was a hunger to see the rest. The builders, the thinkers, the risk-takers, the ones who never waited for recognition but kept building anyway. In Cleveland, a woman named Nadine, born in Togo but raised in Ohio, organized a photo exhibit called We Build. It featured portraits of African immigrants across the Midwest. Engineers, nurses, janitors, and teachers with handwritten notes about what they had built, both in Africa and in America. The exhibit wasn't flashy, just a hallway in a community college, but lines formed out the door. Some people left in tears. "I never saw us represented like this," one visitor said. "Not even in school, definitely not on TV." Meanwhile, schools across the U.S. began reaching out to African scholars for guest talks. One Zoom lecture by a Burkina professor named Issa Sanu at a university in Pennsylvania attracted over 700 students and faculty. He spoke plainly, with humor, and at one point said, "The irony is, we've always known who we are. It's just taken everyone else a little longer to catch up." In Ouagadougou, the hospital featured in Traoré's video saw a small crowd gather outside, not for protest or praise, but curiosity. Locals came to see the building that had become a symbol. Nurses inside reported visitors bringing handwritten thank you notes. Some simply came to sit in silence and think. No one asked for cameras. No one tried to make it go viral. It already had. Back in the U.S., producers at a major news network pitched a full-length documentary on modern African infrastructure. One executive finally greenlit it, not because it was trendy, but because the demand was real. "This isn't charity," the executive said in a meeting. "This is relevance." And for once, the tone of the coverage had shifted. No voiceovers filled with pity, no sad piano music, just real people talking about real work. Solar farms in Burkina Faso, coding academies in Senegal, architecture collectives in Rwanda, agriculture cooperatives in Mali. Brick by brick, story by story, the continent that had been reduced to a caricature began reclaiming its narrative. And it wasn't being done with fanfare or vengeance. It was being done with fact. One post from a Burkinabe teenager named Ibrahim captured the mood perfectly. "They didn't believe us when we said we were more than the pain, so we showed them the joy." But as pride rose and stories multiplied, the woman who lit the match was finally being pushed to say something, whether she wanted to or not. It took 9 days. 9 days of silence, pressure, and mounting public scrutiny before Karoline Leavitt finally appeared on camera again. The announcement was abrupt. She would deliver a personal statement via live stream from her media platform studio in Dallas, Texas. No press allowed, no questions permitted, just her. The backdrop was carefully chosen. An American flag behind her, a polished wooden desk in front. She wore a muted navy blazer and minimal makeup. The image was meant to convey seriousness, humility, maybe even contrition. But the moment she opened her mouth, it was clear something was off. "I want to address the comments I made last week," she began, her tone flat, rehearsed. "My intention was never to offend anyone. I was speaking from a place of frustration about the misuse of foreign aid and government mismanagement in developing regions." Already the first red flag. She hadn't mentioned the actual word that ignited everything. Zoo. She avoided it, danced around it, like it had slipped out of her mouth by accident, and she didn't want to dirty her lips with it again. "I've learned that my words were interpreted in ways I didn't intend," she continued. "And for that, I am sorry." The phrase was so vague it barely meant anything. What exactly was she sorry for? How her words were received? Or that she'd said them in the first place? The apology lasted under 4 minutes. There were no questions afterward. The stream cut immediately after her closing sentence. "I remain committed to honest conversations, even when they're difficult." Viewers weren't buying it. Within minutes, social media lit up again. But this time, the tone was different. Not rage, not outrage, just disappointment. "She sounded like someone reading a script they didn't believe in," one post read. "Didn't even say Africa, like it's a ghost word now," wrote another. A video response from a Nigerian-American poet named Timmy gained traction fast. She watched Leavitt's apology in real time, then turned to the camera. "She said she was misunderstood. That's not an apology. That's a deflection," the poet paused. When someone calls your home a zoo and then apologizes for how you heard it, that's not healing. That's PR. Others followed suit. A Kenyan journalist tweeted, "There are times when silence is a form of respect. But this was noise disguised as regret." Even some of Leavitt's usual allies distanced themselves. One conservative columnist wrote a piece titled, "When Words Fail Twice." In it, he admitted that while he supported her platform, he couldn't defend an apology that seemed more focused on optics than ownership. Back in Ouagadougou, President Traoré didn't respond to the apology. His office didn't issue a statement. Local media barely covered it. To them, the story had already moved on. They weren't waiting for remorse. They were too busy building on the momentum of dignity and pride the video had ignited. But in New York, something else was happening. A group of African and African American scholars organized a roundtable at Columbia University. The event, titled "Who Tells the Story?" discussed not only Leavitt's comment and Traoré's response, but the larger patterns behind them. How language shapes perception and how apology without reflection only deepens harm. One student stood up and said, "It's not just about a word, it's about what that word represents, and how quickly people retreat into vague apologies when they get caught." Another panelist, a professor from Burkina Faso teaching in the U.S., added, "You cannot apologize for causing harm if you still believe the thing that caused it." The room was silent for a long time after that. In Texas, Karoline stayed offline for the next 2 days. Her team fielded emails, drafted statements that were never published, and watched as the views on her apology video stalled at just under 800,000. That number would have been huge for her 3 weeks earlier. Now it felt like no one was watching, because the moment had passed and she had missed it. But across the world, a bigger story was still unfolding, one that had little to do with her anymore, and everything to do with how people were choosing to carry forward the conversation she never truly joined. By the 3rd week, Karoline Leavitt's name had faded from the top of the trending lists. Her apology sat quietly on her page, accumulating the occasional comment. But the public had moved on, not out of forgiveness, but because something larger had taken hold. It wasn't about her anymore. What lingered wasn't the insult, but the clarity that followed it. Across the U.S., in classrooms, churches, and living rooms, real conversations were happening. The kind that don't always make the news. Conversations about value, about narrative, about how we speak when we think no one is listening. In a high school in Madison, Wisconsin, a social studies teacher named Mrs. Cates scrapped her lesson plan and played Traoré's video for her juniors. Afterward, she asked one question: why did this video move so many people? One student raised his hand and said, "Because he didn't try to prove anything, he just showed us." In that moment, the entire class was quiet. Not because they didn't know what to say, but because they realized they were finally hearing something real. At a college in Austin, a student-led event called Reframing Africa drew over 300 attendees. The keynote speaker, a young Sierra Leonean journalist named Combe, stood at the podium and said, "We're not here to fix an image, we're here to take back the mic." She told a story about her uncle, who ran a clinic in rural Sierra Leone for 2 decades. He never once appeared in a documentary. But if your baby was sick, she said, he would walk 3 hours in the rain to get you medicine. And somehow, he was never the one getting interviewed. Now ask yourself why. The audience didn't clap right away. They just sat with it. Because that was the point. The conversation had become personal, not a political debate, not a headline, just people choosing to look differently. Podcasts that had never covered African news before started entire series on the continent's changing voice. Bookstores began curating sections called Africa, Through Our Own Eyes. Streaming platforms saw a spike in African films and documentaries. And most remarkably, people started listening differently. A college student from Nebraska named Jordan wrote on her blog, "I didn't know how much I didn't know. I used to think developing country just meant poor. Now I realize it often just means overlooked." In Nairobi, a young artist named Faye created a mural depicting a hand passing a microphone to a child wearing a backpack. Below it, she painted a quote from Traoré's video. "We are not chaos, we are builders." Tourists stopped to take photos. Locals stood silently beside it. In Accra, a pop-up exhibit titled Unsaid featured audio recordings of people across the continent sharing what they wished the world would ask them. Not about struggle, but about joy, love, and legacy. One recording from a father in Burkina Faso simply said, "Ask me what I'm proud of. I will never run out of answers." Back in the U.S., churches hosted dialogues between African immigrants and congregants. At a mosque in Philadelphia, a Ghanaian American speaker reminded worshipers, The prophet said to judge people by their actions. So why do we keep judging entire nations by edited footage? People listened, because by now, everyone had seen the difference between noise and substance. Leavitt's comment had sparked the fire, but it was the voices that followed, the lives put front and center, that gave it meaning. And Traoré, he never said another word about it. He didn't need to. The world had already heard him loud and clear. His face was now painted on school walls. His words had made their way into speeches, essays, rap lyrics, and even wedding vows. One young couple in Johannesburg exchanged the line, "We may not have skyscrapers, but we are building our future," as part of their vows. And that was the thing. What had started as a reaction to disrespect had transformed into a celebration of identity, one that didn't need to scream to be heard. But even as the world settled into this new rhythm, one final image would remind everyone why this mattered, why it still does. Early one morning, just before sunrise, a photograph began circulating online. No filters, no framing, just a moment caught by a passing journalist outside the same hospital where President Traoré had recorded his now famous video. In it, an older woman was walking hand in hand with a young boy down the concrete steps. She wore a faded blue dress. He held a folder stuffed with papers, probably prescriptions or homework. They weren't looking at the camera. They didn't know they were being watched. The caption was simple: "No skyscrapers, but the future walks here every day." That single photo traveled farther than anyone expected. It was shared by celebrities, politicians, teachers, activists, parents, not because it was dramatic, but because it was human. It landed like a final sentence to everything that had been said over the past 3 weeks. And it told the truth in a way no apology ever could. In Burkina Faso, life continued. Kids went to school. Farmers watered their crops before the heat set in. Nurses ran early shifts. Engineers adjusted blueprints on laptops that still had cracked screens. They weren't performing for the world. They were just living. And for the first time in a long while, the world was watching without looking down. A school in San Diego painted a mural of the hospital's hallway as part of a student art project. In the center, a quote from Traoré: "Dignity doesn't shout, it builds." A podcast in Melbourne featured African youth voices for 3 weeks straight without interruptions or commentary. They talked about business, science, music, food, not pain, just life. In Montreal, a librarian added a section titled "Built by Us," a rotating shelf of books written by African authors, engineers, historians, and poets. No donations, no sponsors, just a small sign: "You've heard enough about us, now hear from us." And in a town outside Atlanta, a 4th grade teacher named Mr. Kelman gave his class a writing assignment. The prompt was simple: what does the word dignity mean to you? One student wrote, "It means standing without yelling. It means knowing who you are, even if someone else doesn't." Another wrote, "It's building something even if nobody says thank you." At the back of the classroom, a quiet girl named Adila folded her paper before turning it in. Her sentence was just 6 words: "Dignity is not needing a microphone." And maybe that's what stayed with people the longest. That somehow, a quiet walk through a modest hospital in West Africa had said more than all the shouting in the world. Karoline Leavitt eventually returned to public life. She never addressed the moment again. The internet had moved on, as it always does. But a shadow followed her, a knowing pause in interviews, a flicker of discomfort in certain rooms. She hadn't lost everything, but she'd lost something harder to measure: credibility. And Traoré? He went back to doing what he'd always done: working, listening, building. He never followed up his video, never released another statement, never leveraged the moment for personal gain because he knew something his critics didn't, that the most powerful message is the one you don't have to repeat. And the people? They remembered. Not just his words, but the way he said them. Calm, certain, not for applause, but for truth. Because what started as a careless insult had become something far bigger. A mirror, a map, a challenge. And in that space, a lesson emerged. Not shouted, not forced, not packaged for viral consumption, just lived. So the next time someone tries to define another person's worth by their country, their income, or what they don't have, maybe they'll remember this. Maybe they'll ask what's being built, not what's missing. And maybe they'll realize the future doesn't need to ask permission to arrive. It's already here. If this story meant something to you, share it, talk about it, pass it on. And if you want more stories that cut through the noise, subscribe.